Hi, my name is Stephen Norsworthy. I presented a prior video called The Piano Sound is a Moving Target. And now I would like to have a part 2 of that video where we study the C's, C2 through C7, wherein we had just looked at C5. So in part 1 we examined a single example, the note C5, and examined the differences from intentionally spreading the unisons by a half a cent and comparing them to a tighter tuning with virtually no spread. You may go back and review that video if you have not seen it, found on YouTube at the following URL link, and you can look at that link and copy it down and probably find it, and you would be invited to look at it first and then watch this video. In this part 2, we examine the behavior of the C's from C2 to C7. We look at the partial drifts in frequency and the partial drifts in amplitude, wherein before we had just looked at the partial drifts in frequency. Corresponding to the same window lengths and time samples set by the spectrogram parameters. We defined what a spectrogram was in the prior video. In each case, starting with the best no-spread tuning example for us. In each case, as before, we show the results from full unison coupled strings. The individual strings have much simpler decay characteristics, and that's why we're not showing them. The challenge to the piano tuner is to get the final result from the full coupled unison couplings. Illustrating the significance of the Weinrich Drift and the sometimes extreme divergence of the partials, especially the fundamental, as we will see. All examples are taken from my Fazioli F308, which has been regulated to full factory specifications. Yes, I got asked about that. We start with the note C2, and the graph shows the partial frequency changes on the y-axis, and on the x-axis the time offsets in milliseconds. And there are 4 lines on the graph, P1, P2, P3, P4. In each case, the STFT has a 500 millisecond length, that's a half a second, and overlaps 50% to the next window length, sliding a quarter of a second, that's 250 milliseconds, each time. The first output is after 500 milliseconds, the end of the first STFT window length after the hammer attack. We defined what the STFT was. It was called the short time Fourier transform in the prior video. It represents the reference point at 500 milliseconds in terms of frequency changes per time window, hence the starting window. So the starting window would be 0 to 500 milliseconds. At the end of 500 milliseconds, that's our point of reference. The second output, therefore, is from the time window 250 to 750 milliseconds. So at the end of 750 milliseconds, that's the change over that quarter of a second slide of that window. Notice how the P2 through P4 partials show relatively small changes from window to window period on this particular example. If we use the so-called statistical mean or multi-partial single number that would result from a median or mean calculation of the P2, P3, and P4 partials, we would get a steady readout on this particular example. But what do we actually hear aurally? We, of course, lock onto the fundamental P1 the most. It is the pitch we most relate to musically. What is P1 doing? Wild deviations, as you can see on the graph. So what information do we really want? All of it. Not just a multi-partial mean value in the ETD display. We want to make the most informed decision as possible as piano tuners. The choice should be ours to make. We need all the data. Now here I'm juxtaposing both the frequency and the amplitude changes over time. The frequency changes over time would be the graph on the left. Now the one on the right is the partial amplitude changes over time. In the low register of the piano, typically P1 amplitude is much lower than the P2 through P4, but we still lock onto it aurally and identify the note from P1 musically. A rhetorical question. If you had all this information while striking the key and watching it unfold in real time, would you make tuning choices and decisions differently? Let's listen to the recording. Interestingly, you can actually hear that fundamental dropping in pitch after a few seconds, just like the graph shows. You can also hear that the third partial is the highest amplitude. It shows on the graph, and you can hear it. You can hear that third partial as a high amplitude note, but you still lock on to P1 as the most dominant note. Your ear locks on to P1. Now let's go to C3. On C3, we have, as before, we have the partial frequency changes graph on the left and the partial amplitude changes graph on the right. The deviation of C3 on this particular piano is fairly tight. Every note and every piano will vary. There are no generalizations. That said, look at the spread at the 4-second mark. It's significant. That spread is almost 1 cent. We still maintain that the tuning should occur in the early time window. Look at the amplitude after 4 seconds. It's down significantly. We cannot take this out of context with actual piano music. The higher the note, the more significant, as we shall see. Remember that the low register of the piano has the most amplitude sustain, and yet we should not rely on a tuning stability long after the strike. You can hear it on this recording that the fundamental does go up and then down after, like the graph shows, after about 3 seconds goes up, 4 seconds goes down. You can hear that little twangy sound. It gets twangier as you go further out in time because the third partial is becoming more dominant. But yet, in this graph, the second partial has the most amplitude, the most power. You can see that on the amplitude graph. Now let's go to C4. Again, as before, partial frequency changes on the left, partial amplitude changes on the right. The first time point of references will be at 500 milliseconds, where the first STFT block will be processed and completed. C4 shows a very unexpected characteristic change from C3. We see the sharp rise and fall of P1 after 1 second, and it changes our perspective on what's happening. If we were to tune in the intervals of either 0 to 500 milliseconds, or 250 to 750 milliseconds, or 500 milliseconds to 1,000 milliseconds, we would have stable tuning regardless of whether we use some statistical multi-partial combination or any one of them individually, because things are fairly stable in that first second. Again, there is no generalization from note to note or piano to piano about the degree of these types of partial changes over time. If you listen to that again carefully, you can hear that little fluctuation of that first partial in the 1 to 2 second time interval. But you can hear that the attack is very clean and very stable in the first second. Now let's go to C5. Now what's interesting here in C5, if you recall the first video I made, I showed the C5 example. Now here I'm showing the C5 example. I'm using the same processing that I'm using for C2 through C7. It's almost the same graph, a little bit different, but has the same characteristic as before. Now, if you look at the C5 partial frequency changes on the left, its frequency drift characteristic is first downward on the P1 to minus 0.6 cents, and then upward it rises to more than plus 1 cent by 4 seconds. If we tuned this note in the first 1 second, we would have both high power and a stable area of partial frequency changes. C5 is the first note above the upper break for this piano. From this note up on this piano, the P1 is stronger than the upper partials. You can hear that attack in that first 1 second is very clean and very stable. You can hear things fluctuating partial-wise and amplitude-wise also after that, but the power is significantly down. Let's go to C6. We need to tune this note in the first half second, no later than 3/4 second. I maintain that because what we have both high power and a stable area of partial frequency changes. If we use a statistical averaging of the partials, a multi-partial statistical averaging, we would still and would see a strong deflection up from 500 milliseconds to 1 second windows, and then a strong flattening of the pitch after 1 second. So the multi-partial average of these three partials would still have the same characteristic as the three we see on the graph on the left. It's no wonder that real piano music of melodic lines above C6 move quickly or use the sustain pedal and have accompanying notes below. Hence, I maintain that both power-wise and musically, we tune in the attack window in less than 1 second. Now let's go to C7. Here I'm only showing two partials. The second partial would be C8. And in this case, we're going to see some of the same characteristics we saw in C6, but now more so. Why do I say that? Look at both the first and second partial. They both go up after 500 milliseconds. And so a multi-partial averaging of these two would still go up after 500 milliseconds. And I'm not knocking multi-partial displays. I'm advocating that we need to see all the data. Again, we need to tune this note in the first 500 milliseconds and no later than 750 milliseconds. And the graph shows us that and shows us why. We have both high power and a stable area of partial frequency changes. If we use a statistical averaging of the partials, we would still see a strong upward deflection after that 500 millisecond to 750 millisecond window. So the multi-partial average does not really help us much up here in the high register. The higher we go, the less it helps. And I will say again, we need all the data. Now I'd like to offer my perspectives on this entire series of videos, the first part that I made and now this being the second part. About my work and how it relates to the piano industry, full disclosure. I am in the research business in a field called signal processing engineering. I write my own analysis software for my own research and for educational purposes. I do not sell piano tuning apps, but I do offer unique hardware devices to assist in tuning. About the piano app software business. The piano tuning app business is a commercial business with the following characteristics. The market is very small. The profit is generally small. Most app makers have another full-time job. The app makers protect their product and all of their intellectual property, not disclosing the real science behind their apps. And now let's talk about piano tuners. Piano tuners generally consider themselves as artists. Piano tuning is a tradition that is very slow to embrace change. Many would prefer to keep it that way rather than embrace the real science behind the tuning math and the signal processing going on. Therefore, anything that sheds light on the need for improvements in the industry is often not welcomed, but considered adversarial, no matter how it's presented. It's adversarial from the standpoint of the piano app software business, and it's adversarial from the point of view of the piano tuners. So professional engineers generally have stayed away from the piano industry for all the above reasons. Thank you for watching this video.